Greetings all, FerrariMan601 here. Welcome back to Assetto Corsa and welcome to Silverstone. Today we're going to take a look at what it takes to do a hot lap around this place in a Formula 1 car circa 2020. Silverstone, it is the oldest circuit on the calendar in terms of its tenure with the Formula 1 World Championship because it hosted the first ever official Formula 1 World Championship Grand Prix all the way back in 1950. The circuit, of course, it has changed quite a bit over the 70 years since that first day in May 1950, but several key elements of it do remain intact to this day, as well as some of the circuit's heritage remain intact as well. Take a look through the infield here, and you can see these now 3 strips of concrete that kind of trisect the circuit. You can see that they intersect there around the midfield section of the circuit, and then it continues out toward Stowe Corner out there in the upper left-hand corner. Those are runways, and those runways were part of the RAF Silverstone base that was on this site, and it served as a military airfield during the Second World War, supporting things like the Lancaster bombers. So, Silverstone, it has a very long history, a very important history, and one that is not entirely linked to motorsport, although since the end of the Second World War, Silverstone was repurposed into a circuit. Initially, it was an airfield circuit, using parts of the runways for cars, as well as using the taxiways as a sort of perimeter around what used to be the flight line area of the base, and that's where the cars ran around, and that was the configuration that was used in that initial 1950 Grand Prix. However, Silverstone has gone through a number of improvements and renovations since then, yielding ultimately the circuit as we see it today. It is 5 kilometers in length, 5.8 kilometers in length actually, almost 5.9 really, and it is rather complicated. However, it is somewhat unique of the circuits on the Formula 1 calendar in that it really doesn't feature any significant elevation changes as you go along the 5.9 kilometer lap, which is somewhat of a rarity on Formula 1 circuits these days. And of course, compared to other circuits that are its peers really, in terms of having featured in that initial 1950 season, places like Monaco, very tight, very short, lots of elevation changes on public roads. Spa-Francorchamps, of course, lots of elevation change there through the very famous Eau Rouge-Raillon complex. But Silverstone, it's very flat and it's very fast, and because this is the site of a former airbase, the winds around here tend to be very strong and very consistent, which means that car setup is important in terms of dealing with crosswind around this place. However, if we are able to move down through the atmosphere here and come back down toward the starting grid area as we see it now in 2020, it is right here. As we go through the earth there. This is the start-finish straight here at Silverstone. They call it the International Pit Straight, and it is quite long, as you can see. There are the start lights, 5 of them. They all come up, and then they all go out, and then the race begins, and we get to the starting grid pole position right along here. So this is roughly the view that the pole sitter gets when the 5 lights go out. Obviously, this part of the circuit is somewhat new and somewhat renovated. It's been here for a while, but it's also been upkept and modified quite a bit over the years. The starting grid was moved here for the 2010 British Grand Prix, 2009, the last time that the old start-finish straight before Copse Corner was used for the start of the Grand Prix, although that part of the racetrack remains. The biggest change, though, is the new pit lane here in Silverstone, including this big Silverstone wing building, I believe it's called. This houses all of the media centers where the commentary boxes are, where the journalists hang out, and the VIPs and such. I believe some of the accommodations for team personnel is also in this building, but don't quote me on that. And, of course, we have the pit lane proper and the garage areas where the teams are all set up for the race weekend. Here is the entrance to the pit lane, and you can see that it comes down off of the straight here, out of the exit of Stowe Corner, and the pit in is all the way back here. So there you go. There is your pit entrance. You come into the pit lane, and for Formula 1, the speed limit line is someplace around here, and you can see that there is a line on the road demarcating that. So all of this through here has to be taken at pit lane speed around this corner. Then you enter the pit lane, and then depending on where your garage goes, you have quite a long run down to your pit area. As you can see here, we've got a car loaded up right here at the end of the pit lane, so there is the garage area for this car here, which happens to be Formula Hybrid 2020 in a Mercedes livery there. However, the pit exit comes out through here, and then the limiter line is right about here. So pit lane speed comes off, and then you're dumped out immediately into the farm corner. And there is the white line demarcating the end of the pit exit right there, and your white line separating the racing line from the pit exit. Do not cross this white line. If you are exiting pit lane, you'll get a penalty in all likelihood. However, beginning a normal lap here at Silverstone, you'll come out a club corner here, which is now the final corner on the circuit, flat out in a 2020 Formula 1 car. You'll come over to the left-hand side of the circuit, and then here we go. You're coming up through 6th, 7th, and 8th gear. You'll be pulling it right about here, and the start-finish line is there. So start-finish, there's pole position, there's P2, and then start-finish, the timing line is here. So we begin the lap. We are flat out in 8th gear, doing about 300 kilometers an hour or so, and then we start to pick up these entrance curbs here. You can use these. You cannot use these. It's kind of dependent on your car setup as well as what you're trying to do. If you're on a really fast lap, you're going to be using these entrance curbs as you're approaching the now turn 1 Abbey corner. Right about here is the turn-in point for turn 1. And then immediately you can see where our apex is here in the Abbey corner. Completely flat out in qualifying and completely flat out in most circumstances in the dry in terms of being in race trim as well. Apex speed about 300 kilometers an hour right here. You can see here, this is what remains of the old Abbey chicane. And this was last used for the 2009 edition of the British Grand Prix. You can see the tarmac is still here, but it is disused as far as I can tell. But you used to come out of Abbey. This is Bridge Corner, which unfortunately is not runnable in Assetto Corsa, but Bridge Corner here, named for the bridge, of course, that crosses the track. And then this was absolutely crazy. By 2003, 2004, Bridge was entirely flat out in the dry, about 180 miles an hour through there, believe it or not. And then here you would come up into Priory, where you will rejoin the circuit as it is today. But we're not quite there yet on our run-through of Silverstone. So back in reverse into Abbey as it is today. There's the apex of the corner. Again, flat out, about 300 clicks. You'll continue to go flat out, and we will remain on line here. So you come to the exit of Abbey. Again, flat out, and if you're running in clear air, no reason to lift. And immediately we get into turn 2, or the farm corner. Again, completely flat out in 8th gear, still around 300 kilometers an hour, because even though this is a flat out corner, of course, we are turning, so you will scrub off a little bit of speed through here. This curbing is very flat, as you can see, so it's entirely usable, and unless, again, you are trying to fight for position or track conditions just don't allow it, you are going to be using this curbing in all likelihood on a really quick lap here at Silverstone. You'll exit. And even though you have exit curbs around this area, generally we don't see the drivers using these, and typically when I'm on a quick lap here, I won't be using these either, simply because they're just too far over to the right-hand side of the circuit, because we need to be thinking about pre-positioning our car in the middle of the track and then ultimately over to the left-hand side, because now we start to get into our first proper corner of the lap. These entrance curbs here, on a really quick one, you're going to be up on these entrance curbs, and you're going to be braking on these entrance curbs, which is a little bit of a challenge. If the car is a little bit too stiffly sprung, or if it's running a little bit too low to the ground, you're going to bottom over these curbs, and that's going to unsettle things tremendously. So keep that in mind. Even tire pressures can make a difference in this section, because as you come into these curbs, you're flat out. The car is generating the maximum amount of downforce that it possibly can, and then you're going to compromise traction on the left-hand side going over these curbs, and you're going to jump on the brakes, decelerating at a rate of about 6G as we come up into turn 3, which is called Village. coming into the village corner. We'll be braking on the curbs. The turn-in point is about here. We'll go down from 8th gear to 4th or 3rd, depending on how much speed you really want to try and carry to this apex. And you can see that the track is a little bit cambered toward the apex. Again, not really all that much of an elevation change, but there is some camber evident here, and it does help you turn the car in. You do want to get all over these apex curves here to the apex of village. You'll see that there is one of the sausage curbs here to the inside of the flatter curb. Stay off of that, because if you get up on it, it is going to bounce the car into the air. But take this apex curb, right about here is the apex of the corner, and then you start to feed the power in. At the same time, you notice, if we pull out here, you notice the track's pretty wide, and you do have runoff in addition, which means that you have some real estate to play with. You start to get back into the throttle here, and then you just let the car track out to the left, even all the way out to this somewhat narrow strip of curbing here on the exit of Village Corner. You don't necessarily want to use the curbing, but you can. However, just like we had in the approach to Village, you want to pre-position the car for the next corner already, because it's not a very long run down to it. You want to get over toward the left, through the right-hand side of the circuit, rather. Generally, I'd be about here in my approach to our next corner, which is called the Loop. It's a very tight left-hander, but sometimes you'll see the Formula 1 guys in the real world come out to the curbing. Again, the choice is yours. There are several ways to approach this corner without losing any time. However, we'll come into the Loop. It's a very tight corner, 3rd or 2nd gear, apex speed about 100 kilometers an hour right about through here, and then because you're in a low gear and these modern cars have monstrous levels of torque, you are going to deal with some wheel spin as you come back into the power. Even though you've got, for the sake of argument, very soft, brand new slicks on the back of this car, you are going to break traction through here, and it's even worse because the car is in a little bit of a rotational moment as you're coming out of the loop. So keep that in mind as you start to track out right to these curbs. You can go over these if you want, but again, be very careful with wheel spin. But the curbing, as you can see, is very flat. You can use it if you so desire. Right about through here, we'll be going up into 3rd gear, 4th gear, 5th gear. We'll generally be up into 6th gear by the time we turn into the left here of Aintree. 6th or 7th gear here at the apex, you've got all the grip back into the car as your straight line speed has come back up. So this is entirely flat in the dry, no reason to lift whatsoever. If you can position the car strategically here, if you are following somebody, this is a great opportunity to start to build up a slipstream, because as we continue here online and we get to our exit curbing, which you can use, but be careful because you've got this AstroTurf on the outside, and this is a little bit slippery, even though you've got maximum downforce right now. So be careful of that, and also be careful of the trailing edge of this curb, because it's a little bit higher than the leading edge of it, and you can bottom the car there because you've got a lot of downforce now rolled into it, remember. But we have a DRS zone, the first of 2 DRS zones on this lap. It begins right about here. You'll pop the rear wing open, and then you'll accelerate even more, now into 7th and 8th gear, as we come down this long infield straight, which is called the Wellington Straight. You'll cross about 300 kilometers an hour right about here, just as you cross underneath the bridge. And you'll continue to accelerate up all the way, depending on how you've got the car trimmed out. You'll accelerate all the way up to 320, maybe even 325 clicks if you've got a particularly low downforce setup, or if you're in a slipstream. But you do have that DRS helping you, and whatever you're doing with your hybrid energy deploy is also going to be giving you more straight line speed here. Note, we have got an arrow pointing to the left at 90 degrees. That's because we have got a left of 90 degrees there or thereabout right ahead of us. That is the Brooklands corner. And we approach it from all the way out here to track right. And we get all over the curbs as well as we're approaching this corner. It's very important to use all of the road in the approach to Brooklands because, yes, it's a very jagged sort of corner in terms of it turns 90 degrees very quickly, but you'll also notice that it's almost a double apex sort of situation. You'll notice that we have a little bit of camber here, even though the road is still very flat, but the curbing starts to come in long before you actually turn in. We're still going straight about here, and you can see that that curbing is starting almost concurrently to where we're turning in. So you don't necessarily want to be picking up all of the curb immediately. You'll turn in, though, and eventually you'll apex in 4th or 5th gear, right about here, where the old circuit joins in. That tarmac comes back in. This would have been the run out of Priory, or this really would have been part of the Priory corner on the old circuit. But you'll continue to follow the road until you reach the bollard, and then you'll tuck the car in even more over this green painted concrete for a second apex. So you can think of the Brooklands corner as a double apex left-hander. So yes, it does look pretty jagged in terms of it crosses through 90 degrees very quickly. But at the speed that you're going, you want to carry momentum. So you don't want to just round the, you don't want to cut the corner off basically too jaggedly, even though you don't have all that much real estate to play with. So it becomes a double apex corner. You're all over this concrete here, and then you see it runs out pretty abruptly. So you'll get the car positioned back over through the right hand side here, accelerating flat out again in 4th or 5th gear. Usually by the time we would reach this point, we're in 5th gear. And you use a little bit of this, I suppose you could call it exit curbing for Brooklands, but I kind of think of it as entrance curbing to the next corner, which is Luffield. Right about here, we'll let the car go out a little bit toward the left, and you'll notice we have a little bit of camber dialed in toward the apex again. So again, even though we don't have all that much elevation change, the camber is there to help us somewhat. Little dab on the brakes down into usually 3rd gear, and then this is a very interesting corner. There are multiple ways you can approach this. You'll see some drivers will deliberately overrun the entrance of the corner, and they'll let the car go out to about here before they start to turn in, and then they sort of square off the corner like this, apexing late and then launching out. Other drivers, you'll see them do things a little bit like this, where they will come in and then they'll brake earlier and they'll actually slow down more, and then they will jump all over these curbs, and then they will just hold the right front on these curbs until almost the final moment before slamming the throttle and then exiting through here. Whichever way you choose to do it, it's up to you. There are advantages and disadvantages to each. If you try to hug the apex like we did on that last fly-through, you will wear your tires faster. Conversely, if you continue to just sort of stay straight and then sort of make your turn in a little bit more jagged and abrupt, we could approximate that a little bit better, that would be helpful. But right about here, turn in, make your turn in more jagged and abrupt, apex very late, and then launch out. You are going to be using your rear tires more, particularly in that traction zone. So again, there are benefits and disadvantages to either approach. Regardless, on the exit, you'll see this very wide curbing, and it's backed up by AstroTurf. Generally speaking, you want to use the curbing, but not the AstroTurf, because again, this is a very, very important traction zone, because we do have a bit of a straight coming up, and the Woodcote corner as well, which is flat out nowadays. Use the curbing, don't use the AstroTurf. However, if you have to use it, it's not a terrible thing. Just remember that the back end might step out, and then by the time you get into the concrete here, you want to start thinking about getting the car back over toward the right-hand side of the circuit, because the curbing and the concrete run out concurrently right here. So generally speaking, a line out of the apex of the Luffield corner is going to look something like this. We'll go out and we'll just gradually come over. We'll reach our maximum extent of track out right about here over the concrete, and then pretty abruptly we'll come back over toward the right-hand side of the circuit. Accelerating out here through 6th gear, 7th gear to this point. This is now Woodcote corner, completely flat out. For a modern Formula 1 car, this is barely a corner anymore. There's no reason to lift or anything. But we have got apex curbing nonetheless. You can use it or you cannot use it. It really is up to you. And of course, you can see some of the heritage of Silverstone left here. This is the old pit lane that was used for Formula 1, because this is the old start-finish straight that was used for Formula 1. And you can see that the pit lane is still here, and it is still used for some other configurations of the circuit, although it is no longer used for Formula 1. But there it is, and you can just see how much less comprehensive and stupendous looking the pit lane on this side of the circuit is. So you can see why Formula 1 made the renovations that they did to move the pit lane and everything else. But there it is. So out of the Woodcote corner, you can see completely flat out. You have exit curbing here as well. You can use it, but the exit curbing actually goes the entire length of the straight, more or less. You can see it starts all the way through the exit of Woodcote, and then it continues down to Copse Corner. So you can use this if you want, but it's really just going to be imparting more drag on the left-hand side of the car at this point because, again, you're flat out. Right about here, this is the old finish line. Right about here, you're going to be popping 8th gear, which means that you're pretty much VMAX. There's no DRS at this point, so any more rolling resistance is a hindrance to us. So stay off of this curbing for the most part. You can use it a little bit, but by the time you're halfway down the straight, absolutely you're going to be away from it. Anyway, coming down the old start-finish straight, you can see we've got another 90-degree arrow, this time pointing to the right. This is the warning that you get before Copse Corner. Believe it or not, and again, you're about this height in the Formula 1 car. Believe it or not, there's a corner up ahead, and it is mightily quick, but there's no warning of it other than that one sign. That's the only warning you get. You can see that the pit wall here changes from white to red, so that's another indication, and the tarmac changes here. It becomes slightly lighter in color, but it just sort of comes up on you. And if you're not ready for it, you are going to go straight on, because at this point you're doing about 305 kilometers an hour, and this whole straight just absolutely evaporates. You're only on it for like 4 or 5 seconds. It's ridiculous, the sorts of speeds that we do. But Copse Corner, this entrance curbing, really, it's just along the side of the track for the entire length of the straight, but it becomes entrance curbing here. You can use it if you want. It's not very severe, it's not very harsh, it's not going to unsettle the car too badly, so you can use it if you want. And then Copse Corner just jumps out of no place. It's entirely blind on the entrance, as you can see, but you want to tuck in toward the apex, and you will use the apex curbing. Right about here is the apex of the corner. So if we just go pull out here, you can see the length of the corner that we've gone through. It's a reasonably late apex for Copse Corner, but it's amazingly fast. 300 kilometers an hour, maybe even slightly quicker, is the speed that you'll be doing when you reach this point. It is utterly immense. I remember in the V10 days on groove tires, Copse was always a test of a driver's mettle. How long would he wait before he lifted? Would he have to pull a downshift or not? That was cool to watch, but Formula 1 has moved on so much now that this is flat in qualifying, and it's flat in the race, provided that it's dry, of course. So completely flat out through Copse Corner. You'll apex reasonably late, and then you just let the car drift out wide to the exit curbs right about here. This is important in terms of track limits, and the curbing here is not entirely representative of what it is in the real world anymore. But the curbing is inbounds, and the AstroTurf is inbounds. But if you get the right side wheels of the car beyond this white line to the left-hand side, your lap time is going to get thrown out. And if you made a pass coming into Copse Corner, and then you've got a late apex and then a long exit, and you go wide here into the run-out zone, the FIA is going to tell you to give that position back. So be very careful about how much exit curb you use coming out of Copse Corner. However, as we exit Copse Corner, 8th gear, we've been in 8th gear the whole time, around 310 kilometers an hour through this point. Now, we have got an arrow here which goes in like 17 different directions with squiggles and things. This is the legendary Beckett's Chapel Complex, and it starts right here with these entrance curbs. We use these. We're doing 305, 310 kilometers an hour at this point. These curbs, although they're pretty long now that we look at them like this, they look like they are about 2 inches long when you're at speed. So you got to be very, very deliberate in terms of how you position the car out of Copse Corner and as you come back toward the right-hand side of the circuit so that you can hit these. You hit these with the right side wheels, both the front and the rear, and then you use that little bit of roll to launch you over to the left-hand side so that we can get into Maggots Corner. We use this curbing as well. We just go over it straight. This is where Daniel Fiat had his tire come apart a week ago. That was a scary incident. He was okay, thankfully. And then into Maggots. Look at this. Completely flat in a modern Formula 1 car. This is our apex for the Maggots Corner. It is crazy fast, about 300 kilometers an hour. And again, this whole view, it is so amazingly compressed. as you're at speed. Again, you start taking the corner right about here, you jink back over to the left, you hit this curving, and then you jink over to the right, and you apex the maggots corner. It's ridiculous. It really, really is. You can see that the circuit cuts back toward the infield here. This is another one of the configurations here at Silverstone. This is one of the national circuit configurations. We don't use this, but it's important that you're aware of it, because if you're just sort of napping and you're not totally familiar with this place, you may be so inclined to follow this curbing into the barrier. So don't do that. So, in other words, we apex the maggots corner absolutely flat. Let the car drift out a little bit to the left, basically to the center of the circuit, and then we straight line this section. And we do that because the Beckett's corner is right here. And the apex of the Beckett's corner is this very, very short strip of concrete that we're aiming for, along with the curbing, as you can see. Curbing here, basically the same as it is at every other point on the circuit. This outside curbing, just ignore it, doesn't matter, we don't use it. But over here, we absolutely do. You want to take the Beckett's corner flat out as well at about 300 kilometers an hour, and the apex right here. We use all this curbing, we use the concrete if we have to, and then we stay hard in the throttle all the way to about this point, because the chapel corner is next, and it apexes right here. Now, you can see that we have got ourselves curbing and concrete. You want to use the curbing, and if you need it, if you have the grip, you can use the concrete as well, but be careful, because this is about a car's width here. If you go inside of the white line, your lap time is going to be thrown out, so be careful with this. But we downshift into 6th or 5th, depending on what you want to do. In the 2020 cars, if you're on a quick lap, 5th gear is almost going to be out of range of the speed that you're going to do, so be careful that you don't get into a mechanical over rev here. But we'll apex here. This is still about 240, 250 kilometers an hour, even faster on a really quick lap. And you use all this curbing, you use the concrete, but you'll notice this is a pretty severe corner. Again, there's really not much elevation change here, and this corner is pretty flat as well. There's a very little bit of camber, but for the most part, we're flat, straight, and level. What this does is, as we start to pick up the throttle again, right about here, the car is just going to want a straight line. And you'll notice if we straight line, what happens? Uh-oh, we go straight into the grass. Yeah, that's the job done right there. So you have to resist the temptation to jump into the throttle really, really hard and just send it for all it's worth, because you're just going to go off. What you do have, though, at least here in Assetto Corsa, and what they have done in the real world, is extend this. But here we have a little strip of concrete, and that's it, which really isn't placed very well, because if we just go on a tangent line from the apex and we just go straight, as we saw before, you're just going to end up in the grass. So that's no good. So you do have to follow the lay of the land a little bit and bring the car out more gradually so that you exit the corner properly right here. Now, literally, this right here, this is where you exit the corner. And you'll notice the curbing doesn't start until here. So in the real world, they've extended this curbing to about this point, and that solves this problem. But for our purposes in Assetto Corsa, at least, we're aiming for this point just ahead of the curbing. So again, right about here is where we're aiming. And you notice that, well, there's a little bit of rain gutter here, and then you get into the curbing. If you come into the curbing from the grass, you're going to get bounced into the air, so don't do that. So it really is a matter of just being very careful and making sure that if you do pick up any grass, it is just the sweetest of kisses before you get into the curbing proper. This curbing here through the second part of the chapel corner, this is where you can use it, and you want to use it, because you're accelerating hard up into 7th gear right here, and then we exit onto hanger straight. You have the exit curbing here. You can or cannot use it. It really is your choice. Generally, I don't really use it because you've got a lot of momentum carrying you to the outside out of this corner. And if you hit the curbing, generally you've let that carry you a little bit too far. And you've got to put in some pretty severe steering angle to get back toward the center of the racetrack. So I try to avoid this, but you can use it. It's not a death sentence either way. However, Hanger Straight begins here, and the second and final DRS zone of the lap begins right here. 7th gear, hitting 300 kilometers an hour, will pull 8th right about here, and we'll be braking 310 or so underneath the bridge. You'll continue to go down Hanger Straight, just very gradually moving the car to the left, crossing the center line of the circuit, and then the only real part of elevation change that we get into is right here in the approach of Stowe Corner. You can see there is our arrow. I don't think we have another one on the other side of the track. We don't, but there's our arrow telling us, okay, this is a corner going through a pretty obtuse angle. So, indeed it is. 8th gear, still accelerating hard, usually with the DRS open and the manual override in the ERS boost. You're pushing 330 clicks right about here. So this is the top speed of the lap. You'll see these entrance curbs start to come in for Stowe Corner. Don't use them. The car is totally loaded up at this point. If you use these entrance curbs, you're going to bottom, and you're going to just lock the brakes when you slam on them, and you're going to end up right there in that barrier where Michael Schumacher ended up in 1999, where he broke his leg and arguably lost the 1999 World Championship per consequence. So don't do that. However, coming into Stowe Corner, you will downshift from 7th through 6th, and sometimes even into 5th gear. And Stowe Corner is very, very fast. You'll also notice that the camber of this is almost entirely flat, and through the second part of the corner it even goes a little bit off camber slightly, right here as we go over the crest of the hill, basically the only hill on this circuit. So be careful about that. However, from your turn-in point, which is, once again, about here, yes, you'll be getting your downshifts done, and you'll be getting your braking done, but it happens very, very fast with the way that these modern cars decelerate. You'll come in and you'll pick up the apex curbing right about here, and you'll just ride that for a moment, but you then immediately want to use the topography to give you a little bit of a gravitational advantage as you come off of the apex, accelerating hard now up into 6th and 7th gear coming through here. These exit curves are absolutely usable, and you absolutely should use them. The AstroTurf is also usable, but be careful of track limits again. Right side wheels inside of the white line, no good. Accelerating hard, be mindful of the AstroTurf because it could also spit you off in the wrong direction if you're not careful. And then we come back toward the center of the track. There's your pit entrance. We don't want to go there. We'll just continue to accelerate. 7th gear has been pulled. We're getting close to the rev limiter in 7th gear right about here as we approach the squiggle arrow here showing 290-degree bends. You can pull 8th, but most of the time it's better just to let it rev out in 7th in all likelihood, because you'll lose a little bit of time downshifting from an extra gear, because now we get into the braking zone. For the final two corners, we have the Vale corner. Really, this here is the proper Vale corner. This is not used any longer. You can see the changes done to the circuit. This used to be the Vale corner. It was much more gradual on its entrance, but now we have the Neo Vale corner, which is just a 90-degree left-hander. You'll start to brake a little bit before this curbing comes in. You start to brake about here, and then the curbing comes in. You can use the curbing if you want. Be careful about locking up the right front in particular over this curbing, though. You'll go down from 7th or 8th gear down into 2nd or 3rd gear. Usually you want to use 3rd gear here because it gives you a little bit more insurance on wheel spin as you get back into the power. But you'll turn in very sharply. You'll hit the apex curbing here for the first part of the Vale corner, and you'll even use a very little bit of the sausage curb. But again, be mindful of how big that is. That's very, very high in comparison to the rest of the curbing. So be careful about it. You can basically just use the sidewall of your left side tires just to kiss it very, very sweetly. But you'll come off of the apex, and then immediately we start to go over to the right-hand side of the track, and we will overrun the apex here of the first part of Club Corner. You'll use this little bit of concrete apron because you're going to make the corner a little bit shorter by so doing. You'll use that curbing, and then you'll come off following the racing line toward the exit curbing of, I guess you could call it Club 1 right there. But You're also getting very hard into the power here, coming up out of 4th gear, 5th gear. Still, wheel spin is possible. The downforce is not as high as it will be at higher speeds, so be careful. And if your tires are pretty hot or starting to get worn, you're going to get wheel spin here as well. So just be mindful of that. If you're really worried about wheel spin, don't use the curbing, but you are going to be sacrificing a little bit of ultimate pace by doing that. However, now, the second part of Club Corner and the final part of Club Corner, totally flat now. You can cut the quarter very, very sharply by using this apex curbing if you want. It's not required, but it is technically a little bit of a shorter distance and therefore faster. But coming up through here, 5th gear, 6th gear, 7th gear you'll be pulling right about now. And there is our exit curbing out of club. And now we're back onto the International Pit Straight. You'll be pulling 8th gear right about now. And there is the start-finish line. And that is, generally speaking, what a really quick lap at Silverstone looks like in terms of what you're thinking about and how you have to execute if you're going to be trying to set any personal bests or any all-out lap records around this place like Lewis Hamilton and Valtteri Bottas have done on the technically 2 British Grand Prix weekends that we have seen in 2020. Absolutely amazing circuit is Silverstone. It's the oldest on the calendar in terms of having the longest tenure on the calendar. And hopefully, Silverstone, in whatever configuration that is either your favorite or whatever configuration that we'll see it in the future, hopefully it remains a fixture on the calendar because it is one of the holy grail racetracks in terms of Formula One and in terms of international motorsport. It's absolutely an amazing place, and I hope we see it for decades to come. I do hope that all of this was informative and interesting for you, though. Until next time, Ferrari Man 601 saying thank you very much for watching, and of course, we will see you soon.